Okay, let this serve as a review for exam 2 for Ethics Online 2022 summer. Let's see, let me pull it up here. So this is on Aristotle. And the questions are... Okay, so a fundamental axiom of Aristotelian virtue ethics is that human flourishing is good. That is, in fact, a fundamental axiom of Aristotelian virtue ethics. Not much to say about that one. Since Aristotle argues that human behaviors and actions occur via choices, which in turn lead to habits, since these choices are not always conscious, but are often habitual, human choice and action itself, therefore, need not always aim at some end or reason. Telos. Remember, telos is goal, aim, purpose. Remember, for Aristotle, even if something is unconscious and you don't even realize what you're doing, which are most of human actions, most of our actions are not deliberate actions, they nevertheless do indeed have a telos, a goal, an aim, a purpose, an aim. So, and what's that aim? Of course, happiness. So every action we do has a happiness. It's the first line of the Nicomachean Ethics. Every good, every choice, everything has a telos, a good. They aim at something. Since no one can quite agree as to the nature or essence of happiness, i.e. in what happiness consists, Aristotle argues that eudaimonia ultimately remains radically and totally different for each individual, despite our common nature as rational beings. Well, remember now, for Aristotle, because of our common nature as rational beings, happiness is in some sense the same for everybody, not radically and totally different for each individual. In other words, there's a relativity to happiness, but not a relativism. According to Aristotle, our behavior, our choices, fails to conclusively affect any change within our character and thus emotional state, since human beings are creatures of habit and inculcate, that is, habituate themselves towards certain dispositions or habits. Remember, for Aristotle, our behavior, our choices lead to our habits, which in turn lead to our character. So our choices absolutely affect change within our character and our emotional state, since we're creatures of habit, and habits are formed by choices, and habits indicate our character. Ethike, ethos, habit and character. For Aristotle, eudaimonia, happiness, is in the end a passivity in the body in accordance with what is own most to our essential nature, namely rationality. Well, happiness is in accord with what is own most to our essential nature, rationality or excellence or reason regulating emotion. But remember, happiness is an activity, not a passivity. And it's an activity in the soul, not the body. Since Aristotle goes to great lengths to distinguish pleasure from happiness, pleasure in the end has absolutely no relation to happiness. This means that happiness has nothing to do with disciplining oneself to be pleased by higher rational pleasures over and against lower irrational pleasures. So remember, Aristotle is against hedonism, the idea that base irrational pleasures will make one happy, that happiness is simply equated with bodily pleasure. But Aristotle does say happiness has everything to do with learning to like and learning to be pleased by the right things, the more rational, the higher desires or pleasures. So happiness does have a relation with pleasure. And happiness in one sense is disciplined rational pleasure, or disciplining yourself to like the higher, more rational pleasures, the true goods of the soul. For Aristotle, anyone can express emotion or passion, but to express emotion rationally at the right place, at the right time, toward the right person, in the right context, and in the right amount concerns moral virtue or excellence, and is thus quite difficult and requires reason regulating emotion by reason, logos. So that seems pretty straightforward. For Aristotle, happiness remains entirely subjective and thus outside of the realm of human agency and responsibility. Happiness, remember, for Aristotle is somewhat subjective, but not entirely. As a matter of fact, a lot of it's objective insofar as it has to do with our essential nature, namely the rational part of our nature. And moreover, it has everything to do with our agency and our responsibility. Remember, it's objective, and it's a choice to a certain degree for Aristotle. The 7 deadly sins from the Christian tradition appropriate Aristotle's moral framework, in particular the idea of sin or vice being excess or deficiency of emotion. Remember, that seems pretty straightforward. All the sins, all the deadly sins, for example, are excesses of self-love, pride being the most prominent, except for one, of course, sloth, which is a deficiency. Self-love is dangerous and destructive to any good friendship for Aristotle. Remember, self-love is the basis of friendship for Aristotle, just proper self-love. So self-love is only problematic when it's excessive and when it's selfishness rather than proper self-love. So it's not dangerous. It's the basis of it. For Thomas Aquinas, charity, caritas, agape, as a theological virtue having to do with God, involves love for God, which in turn leads to love of neighbor and thus the desire for union with all humans, including even our enemies. Thus, for Aquinas, we should desire to be friends with everyone. Well, for Thomas, yeah, I mean, it's love is willing the good for the other, but also desiring union, and friendship is union with the other person. For Aristotle, moral vice always concerns an excess of passion. Remember, moral vice concerns an excess and deficiency of passion or emotion. An excess of self-love toward oneself leads to self-hatred. Moreover, a bad man's disposition is not friendly toward himself, because there's nothing lovable about him. Accordingly, to be such a person means utter misery. So I think that's a quote right from Nicomachean Ethics 9.4 or 9.8, maybe 9.8. So take a look at that there. Since prudence, practical wisdom, or phronesis, involves good deliberation, or knowing how to get what you want, i.e. knowing the correct means to any given end, it ultimately concerns cleverness. Thus, prudence remains corrupt, since cleverness is often abused and used for manipulation, and unable to aid in the good, eudaimonic, or happy life. Remember, practical wisdom is cleverness, knowing how to get what you want, plus the proper end. So it includes cleverness, but it transforms cleverness. So that doesn't mean it's corrupt. It just means that cleverness or knowing how to get what you want is tempered by the right end. When you know how to get what you want, that's good, as long as what you want is good, is the good, not an apparent good or a false good, which Aristotle thinks you can know. For Aristotle, the virtue of friendliness deals with pleasure and pain in social relations. It's a mean between obsequiousness and submissiveness. It is a mean between obsequiousness but grouchiness. So excessive flattery and things like this versus not giving any pleasure in social relations. All of the 7 deadly sins are an excess of passion. Ooh, what about sloth? Discussed in essay format, Aristotle's central claim... Whoop, I lost the quiz there. Central claim in the Nicomachean Ethics, it looked like I was saying, yeah, namely that happiness, human flourishing is objective, not subjective or relative to each individual. What does he mean by happiness and happiness being objective? Moreover, what does our friendship have to do with this? What does friendship have to do with this? Secondly, do you agree? If so, why? If you disagree, how do you respond to his understanding of the nature of the human being, to the idea of the hierarchy of needs, to friendship as being essential to happiness, and thus furthering the claim that happiness is objective? So basically what I'm saying here is, do you explain what Aristotle means by happiness, why it's objective, talk about our essential nature, rationality, happiness is an activity in the soul in accordance with reason and virtue, and what virtue is, and how happiness lines up with that. And the part about, make sure you say what that is. And there's a lot of hints in there from the true or false. But also, if you disagree, convince me that this is wrong, because for the most part, I find this correct. But you can disagree, of course, but I'm looking to be convinced that I'm wrong. And by the way, don't just say I disagree. Say why. Make sure you say why. So the central claim is that happiness is what we all aim at, human flourishing, and it's objective because of our essential nature, not subjective or relative, even though most people think it is. Pleasure is. What does he mean by that? Well, I just sort of said that. Friendship, of course, is how you properly regulate self-love and how you become virtuous and how you become happy in the end, because happiness is the result of virtue, and virtue is the result of having good friends, which is the regulation of self-love. Okay.